All right, then Bob Davis will explain to us why this all is so complicated.
Okay. This emerged from the talk I did last year, which a couple of people will have seen before, but I guess at the end of it, I sort of felt, okay, that was that. And since then, I think the thing has moved on. The thing being the thoughts in my head. So at the last symposium here, I gave a talk about David Guetta, Kelly Rowland's song "When Love Takes Over," which I will now remind you of, whether you like it or not. So it asked lots of questions about, do you feel it too? It's coming over me, all these kind of things act as a fantastic metaphor. The song was an interest to me for a number of reasons. Specifically, the connection between the distributed creativity, as I wanted to call it, because although Guetta forms the star kind of thing, and obviously Kelly Rowland, Reister, who is Guetta's kind of musical MD, plus these interesting people, the Nervo twins, who seem to turn up on a lot of things, and I'm not quite sure what they do. But I have a kind of idea, you know, sandwiches, I don't know what they do. But what was really interesting to me at the time, and still is that the whole track was sent to Veronica Ferraro. And Veronica spent a whole day crafting Kelly Rowland's voice. So the voice you hear is very much the product of a massive piece of computer technology. And it's not that she can't sing, so what was going on? And then eventually it ended up in the hands of the mastering engineer. And so the whole kind of thread was one of a distributed sort of creativity. All very, very good. And I used at the time, and still I'm thinking about this, an idea for, as a way of looking at this, the idea of a virtual performance, which Alan Moore discussed back in 2007. And he suggests that when we listen, when we analyse a recording, we study the trace of individuals working together. So it seemed very appropriate at the time to consider this particular song and the trace left by individuals. And the listeners, according to Simon Fried as well, respond to it as if it were a record of a performance, albeit in the majority of cases a performance that could never take place, hence the idea of a virtual performance. Now, that seems kind of okay because I've used this for a long time, but then in approaching this whole work, I began to rethink the problems of a virtual performance. And the idea of this idea of having an expressive charge within the song as well comes through Alan's writing too. And it's an idea that comes out of an interview with this guy, Mick Glossop, who's been in the business for a long time and produced lots of amazing people, I guess. And he said that it's not a matter of reproducing what's going on in the room, we're making records. We're not making recordings. And he talks about emotional communication, expression, and performance of the artist. Now, when I started sort of juggling all these together, yeah, I was juggling. And then that left me sort of thinking a whole bunch of things, not least of which is about the idea of emotional communication and what actually does music mean and how can we express those meanings. So in analysing, if you like, the distributed creativity and to some extent the ontology of the record and the record as a record and not a recording, I ended up sort of reflecting then on my own experience with this track. And that seemed to me a sort of kind of idea that we'll go through in this particular talk. Emotional communication for some time has been a focus for my own thinking because I am moved by music. And it has a particular point here that I remember vividly back in kind of 79, 80 or something, when I was still writing undergrad essays, which are probably better than the rubbish I write now, writing about Schubert's String Quartet in G and getting really passionate about the sound and not being able to write that I was passionate about the sound. And instead I had to do a very structural kind of analysis of the, you know, the median relationships, etc., etc. And yet, what I really wanted to say, this made me dance around the desk, or you know, something like that. But I knew I would fail, and that seemed so. This has been going on for a long time. So in thinking about this, a number of other factors came into mind as well, and some of those have already been explored in some of the discussions. Not being able to represent my own experience is, in a way, a problem that comes through two things. One is we haven't had a kind of way of dealing with the emotions very well, out of psychology or anywhere else. And the other thing is that a lot of the things I was taught were not necessarily the things I experienced. And this perhaps relates back a little bit to theory books and those kind of things. So that really causes a problem. Conventional music theory and analysis, as Nicholas Cook points out in his article Theorizing Musical Meaning, that the entire domain of somatically engaged experience of music has a potential meaning which lies beyond the grasp of theory and analysis as conventionally conceived. I don't know if that's true, because I think that we can actually grasp something of that somatic experience that you know, we feel. A recent flurry of activity from various strands of psychology and neurology has added significantly to our understanding of emotion and embodied meaning. And there has been significant contributions which have challenged the mind-body dualism of conventional Cartesian wisdom. Slowly and sometimes awkwardly, we begin to develop a new understanding of the ways in which we experience music and the ways in which music as an expressive medium might stimulate a range of responses which we might understand, interpret, or imagine as meaningful. If my original approach to this piece was to follow the traces of the individuals, to consider the ontology of the recorded artifact, distributed creativity, and the virtual performance, this approach shifts focus to consider the record as an experience. The first line of the song points to the idea of complexity, which is, well, complex. In his overview of the philosophy of knowledge, David Huron surveys a number of intellectual currents that he relates to various approaches to acquiring insight and knowledge about music. His journey moves through philosophical complexity, begins with empirical knowledge and moves through David Hume and the problems of induction, conventionalism, instrumentalism, Popper's falsification, positivism, and of course, postmodernism. What emerges from Huron's historical contextualization is that there are no fixed rules, and the fields of scholarship are, he suggests, debating traditions that develop problems and criteria as they go. Now, the importance of that is not particularly Huron's view of this, it's something that, how do we deal with conventional wisdom? And the way that it tends to kind of, as he describes it, I think, black box things, and not allow us to explore outside that area. So in thinking about this issue, I stumbled across Fritz Zwicky, not literally, because he's dead, but you get the idea, who in 1933 was the first to infer the existence of unseen matter, which he referred to as dark matter, a substance that neither emits or absorbs light or any other magnetic radiation at any significant level. To my non-scientific training, to infer the existence of the unseen, not to mention the work on supernova and neutron stars, seems impossible. A combination of observation and theoretical mathematics allowed Zwicky, amongst others, to see the cosmos in a way that was practically and physically impossible. The black holes of music are around us, and it seems to me that had Zwicky been a musicologist, he might have approached the problem in a different way, by using the things we can see in order to reveal those things we cannot. Moore evokes the idea of a trace, of activities, the activities of individuals. But what happens when the trace has to be found in samples, or resamples, because we can never be sure, undefined instrumental bass drones, extensive delays, reverbs, filters, electronic pianos, drums, strings, and a prefabricated spaces, such as we find in When Love Takes Over? Just as Zwicky used theory to find dark matter, perhaps we can assemble a theoretical framework which allows us to make some sense of the sounds I hear and the confusion of complexity. Complexity itself has been represented through chaos theory, and I rather like the idea of complexity as being a mess. Chaos theory studies mess by looking at the behaviour of dynamical systems. And dynamic systems provides an important theoretical point of departure by the suggestion that at any given point in time, a dynamic system has a set of quantifiable variables represented by a point in an appropriate state. The evolution of a dynamical system is a function that describes what future states follow from the current state. To shortcut that, the beginning of the song I can recognise a state, and at various points I can recognise states too. My argument here is probably against systematic boxes. I had to do business studies at once, and I just, that was it. That, there was never a time again, because they love 2D representations of kind of, this is how it works. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. That's okay. I can write that, and I can get good S's on the box, but that's not how it works, because it's a dynamical system. And what we can't do very well, and I think what the videos and things we've seen today do very well, is allow you to enter a dynamical system. We are dynamic people. We are constantly engaged in those kind of things. So, my idea is that to explore the meanings of When Love Takes Over might require a different framework. But I'd suggest it's not one that is unknown to us, but maybe one that's been teased out by academic thought. Observation remains indispensable to developing knowledge and understanding. So, I began to question my own approach of the analytical observations of When Love Takes Over. The model I most frequently use comes from Tag. Somewhere? Right, you're there. Yes. Okay. And his communication model, which has provided all kinds of wonderful explanations and inventions about thinking about music. But what happens, I wondered, if I flip the model and begin, as most music does, not with the composer, or in this case composers, but with the adequate response, or the experience of the music? In taking this route, I'm confronted by a number of methodological and conceptual problems, not least of which is the validity of this approach as a way of empirically gathering the much-needed evidence. From my experience and my continued engagement with this text, I begin to question some of the metaphorical explanations that may, at one level, be useful. And here I'm referring to the idea of an imagined performance. But such an explanation may actually impede our exploration of the musical object. If I do not imagine a performance, which I do not, and I cannot do this for the reasons I've mentioned, because I know how that was made, then what am I engaging with? Studies by Fairhurst, Janata and Keller on sensomotor synchronization with a virtual partner as part of their research and interest in cooperate into tapping studies and sensomotor things suggest that cooperation is an intrinsic human ability, and our ability to work together towards a common goal depends on sensing and reacting to dynamically changing relationships between co-partners. Previous studies into entrainment by Rep and Keller implemented the idea of a virtual partner, where participants were asked to tap a finger in synchrony while attempting to maintain a given tempo with an invisible partner. So it was, if you like, a tape recording, and then you tested the synchronicity, and you were sort of guessing and things like this. While the studies have tended to explore synchronicity, it's based on the human ability to engage in highly complex forms of both physical and social entrainment, and moreover, spontaneous sensomotor engagement with music increases when music is perceived as having more groove, and the amount of experience groove and enjoyment is greater when sensomotor coupling with the music is easier and better. And they created this this little model, which okay, have I missed the model? No, I haven't. I think it's not. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to explain this as easily and as quickly as I can, which is impossible. They looked at this and came up with the model, and there are two things that I just need to kind of get the idea of. The socio-emotional process that we have two kind of large brain mechanisms, I think they call them, which you've been using all weekend and used in your everyday life. There are those things that you just get into the flow, and there are those things where you gain back and think, what? And then you're in that reflective position. So you're into those. There is a continuity between these areas, but they're actually very difficult to pull apart. You can't really do that. So if you're playing drums, okay, and you start thinking about it, quite often you can go out of time, is what they're saying. But if you just allow the flow, then you're responding to this social kind of information at all moments. And the brain has this kind of default mode. It's the thing that got you here, that allowed you to eat your food and take your cup of water and everything else. You think, oh, how did I get here? What happened? Because it has the default mode. And then it has the control mode. But the control mode, the cognitive area, takes up lots of energy. And so the brain says, hey, I can't overload by looking at both. So it sits there in that cognitive kind of zone, and then you come out of it. The interesting thing for me is, armed with this knowledge, which I knew anyway, is I've been kind of not tapping, because I don't understand Rep's kind of fascination by tapping, but I've been gradually making myself more aware of these states. It's all a bit zen, but bear with me, all right? Because as I listen to the music, I'm conscious of going in and out, all those things. And that consciousness, our ability to reflect on this, is an added layer in there, which I think is very special for us, and very, very useful. So, I've lost the notes now, I have to make it up. Nope, there we go. The idea of a virtual partner and our ability to respond to a virtual other, Jacobo, in synchronicity experiments provides a way of understanding the response I have to this record. It should not be new to us, of course, and as Tag has pointed out in so many of our talks, back in 1981, he said, let us assume music to be a form of interhuman communication in which individually experienceable affective states and processes are conceived and transmitted as humanly organised non-verbal sound structures to those capable of decoding their message in the form of adequate, effective and associative responses. But now we have some evidence to say how this works from that sort of rather intuitive kind of approach. So the idea of a virtual performer should not surprise us. Imaginary companions, perceived as real beings, are a well-documented feature of childhood, which, according to Vygotsky, are an important way for children to explore the world. And this persists beyond childhood. And we've been engaging with fictional characters through Mendelssohn today, and in books that we read. And we build characters around these kind of things because of this way we work on an intersubjective kind of basis. And in her discussion of affect and emotion, Margaret Wetherell suggests that the individual is a site in which multiple sources of activation and information about body states, situations, past experiences, linguistic form, flowing thoughts, etc. become woven together. Psychological stabilization occurs when the disaggregated self translates the multiple codes of bodies, cognitive activity and language consciously or automatically into subjective quality, into further actions and into internal and external self-descriptions which may not be further translated into public accounts and narratives for various audiences. Which I thought...
Who's she?
I have no idea she is, but you know, she was my auntie, I'd be proud. Which I thought, you know, was great, because what you were doing was taking those things and translating them into a way through a narrative that we could understand, drawing on other narratives, Emma, and other kind of experiences. And I thought she brings together a number of themes I've tried to explore and explain. The first is that the individual is the key to reading a text and is best placed for accumulating multiple stimuli. These ideas are best processed as parts of the whole which may come together into an understanding of that particular mental state at any given time. Her use of narrative in this definition is also very useful because it relates to the translation of experience. Narratives of a chaotic world, and recently I've been exploring the idea of the emotional narrative as a way of charting the emotional and affective meanings that come from music. And this is from Iqbal, who suggests that narrative is a mode, not a genre. It's alive and active as a cultural force, not just a kind of literature. It constitutes a major reservoir of cultural baggage that enables us to make meaning out of a chaotic world. And not to be forgotten, narratives can be used to manipulate. It's complicated. And in this account, attempted to follow Zwicky by maintaining the kind of empirical account of events through consideration of this dynamic system and moments within the dynamic system. I find my way in the music and I pick up kind of moments. My own reading of When Love Takes Over is a complex, and as yet my thinking has only begun to discover how I might effectively approach the meaning in a potentially valid way for others. New things keep emerging all the time in that text. It's very, very interesting as you kind of read it, and I think that's, you know, how do you do that? Over the course of this conference there's been frequent discussion of experience and the notes in between, and it's those areas that I'm beginning to find most fascinating and also most perplexing. Moreover, I have attempted to find a structured way of understanding the distinctions between cognitive and non-cognitive, and a way of thinking beyond the mind-body dualisms that have constrained a great deal of our theoretical thinking. A fleeting glance is sufficient to gain an in-depth sense of another person's state, whether this person is visible or virtual. We are programmed for interhuman communication, and we can learn to read those through practice. Moore and Frith were not wrong with the idea of a virtual performance, but the concept of a virtual performer allows us to scrutinise the text but the concept of a virtual performer allows us to not only scrutinise the text we read, i.e. listen to, but also ourselves, a point Moore makes in his article. And, to paraphrase, if we do not understand the effects of music in the first place, and we are unable to articulate them to ourselves, how will we communicate them to others? But of course this is not the way. Our academic system has for a long time discouraged subjective readings of any text, but it's not always been like this. My colleague Phil Lagarde reminded me that there's another dimension to music which relates to the spiritual dimension of human life, for which music can be a conduit. This is problematic, and it's a term which Angela Voss discusses in her article, A Methodology of Imagination. She explores the transpersonal, and when she does so, she is aware, she says, of opening a can of worms. Here her argument is carefully made, and she defines transpersonal as existing within a psychological field of exceptional human experience, including the spiritual, which we've just had a nice example of. And in order to provide new insights which she suggests could change previously held assumptions. She describes 4 distinct modes of expression as the literal, the allegorical, the symbolic, and the anagogic, that kind of spiritual otherness, if you like. The literal and the allegorical of seeing things that they are and in terms of something that's well known to us, are well known. The symbolic, she suggests, requires a topological viewpoint where the symbolic requires an acknowledgement of the creative and participatory dimension of our interaction with the text. So your interaction with the text at that kind of allegorical and symbolic level is very, very kind of interesting. We do have ways to communicate this. But if this did seem fantastical, then I'd like to leave you with a thought from Anne Tavis, which suggests that we humans are reflexively conscious biological animals. That is, animals that are not only consciously aware, but are aware of being aware. This means that our experience can be studied as a biological phenomenon from a science side of the divide and as a subjective phenomenon from the human side. This paper began by considering recording as an analysis object, and Moore's idea of studying the trace of individuals. And there's nothing wrong with this approach, but perhaps he misses one important individual all in this, me, the listener who downloads the track. Having studied the trace of the individuals in the recording, Goethe, Riester, Roland, the Nervo sisters, Ferrara and Gruhl, I felt that there was still something missing that's drawn me to this piece time and time again. The track that the fans download is the one I downloaded and listened to, and more importantly, experience. The black holes in the music are difficult to see, but not experienced. And finally, the virtual performer is not necessarily Kelly Rowland. We are making records, and she's constructed, and I know this, but I want to acknowledge that it is me that constructs the experience. As my colleague Anna Abraham, quoting Thomas, points out, imagination is what makes our sensory experience meaningful, enabling us to interpret and make sense of it, whether from a conventional perspective or from a fresh, original, individual one. It's what makes perception more than the mere physical stimulation of the sense organ. It produces mental imagery, visual and otherwise, which is what makes it possible for us to think outside the confines of our present perceptual reality, to consider memories of the past and possibilities of the future, and to weigh alternatives against one another. Thus, imagination makes possible all our thinking about what is, what has been, and perhaps most important, what might be. But possibly, such approach opens up another potential black hole. Is that the time?
Thank you. Bob.
Oh, I was going to leave you with a song again, but we might not have time for that.
Questions, comments, please.
I thought that was absolutely brilliant. As you know, I've been struggling with similar things, but you've made much more sense out of this than I've been able to do. And that's, one of the things that I always found difficult is, these are the concepts, the categories into which our reactions and observable, intersubjectively observable people's reactions and feelings about the music they listen to and use are put into. An emotion is one of these. Of course, music also includes emotion, but the words denoting different emotions are verbal concepts denoting. They don't cover musogenic semantic fields. In the book I have the area of which joy are you on about?
And in different languages.
And in different languages. Thank you.
Different nuances, at least. Already that is a problem. But you've raised some issues here which I think are incredibly important for the holistic notion, the holistic concept of music, and this kind of cut that music makes through human experience, which is a completely different cross section of we have to try and make as much denotative, rationalist, Cartesian sense of it as possible in order to hold our ground in a tradition of learning that is based on those precepts. But we can't only deal with that. So I think we need to do both. We need to be much more rational about the so-called irrational, so it no longer appears to be irrational. and we give it a logic, you know, a verbally describable logic. And you're getting there, Bob. It's very, very good what you've done. Thank you.
Why not?
Anything else?
Can I say that?
A short one, if
Yeah,
you want us.
I heard you with my own ears.
All right. Thank you, Bob. So. All right. Okay. According to the program, we should be at the break now and continuing in 4 minutes.